a real problem. Let's get out of this place. We're going to talk about how we get out of this place, but I first want to say thank you all of you for coming into this place for this conversation. The idea of Risky Talking is to bring together people who work on things having to do with social change and people who work on things having to do with incredible art and creativity. Elizabeth and I are the co-hosts of this series because we wanted to explore a little bit more deeply the way that our worlds connect. We've been together for about 24 years, 23 and a bit, and I think I'm inspired constantly by the way that Elizabeth's work and the work of her extraordinary dancers, who are many of them in this room, expands my sense of the possible. This evening is about expanding our sense of the possible and taking the risks to imagine some different ways of organizing our world. So I want to thank you both so much for being here and introduce you, Elizabeth, to explain what these strings are all about.
I don't know if you've all noticed these red strings dangling down. Actually, here's the deal. So you've got East Side, you've got West Side. It's a theory that Matt McAdon, my technical director, has invented. It should become clear once it begins, and it begins only on your choice, any of your choices, to grab that string, wherever they may be, wherever you may be, and yank it, and then see what happens. Now, I hope I'm not ruining everything. Well, you'll see what happens when you do this. And maybe it's just so inchoate or arcane that you'll think, huh, what are they doing? But I'm told that anyway, well, I shouldn't say that, because then it'll give the whole idea away. But at any rate, you have the autonomy, if you don't like what's happening to you on one side, to make any choice you may. And you know, when audiences get in seats, they usually just will not budge. They just won't leave, even though terrible things are happening to them. And I'm not saying that that is true about whatever. But at any rate, use your judgment and have fun. And the only request I have is please don't not pull them.
All right. The only other request we have is you'll see in your program at the very bottom is the question, what confines you? This is a handy-dandy tear-off sheet. And on the back of it, we encourage you, we invite you, we ask you and implore you to answer the question, what confines you? And we'll take a look at some of those answers and read some of them out at a different point in the evening. We're going to talk for a little while and then come to you all to participate and join in the conversation. So let's get started.
Oh, cool.
Good person. Oh.
Money.
Oh.
Can you sit here and watch it?
Ça commence, clearly. We have begun. It's such an inane question, but I would love to find some way to ask you to share with us a little bit, us who haven't spent time inside, a little bit of what prison is like, what incarceration is like. I know that this weekend is Mother's Day. Or next weekend is Mother's Day. Sometime soon is Mother's Day. Sunday. I'm imagining that's a complicated day. Would that be a place to start? What's happening there right now with the places you've been, places you can visualize that maybe we can't? Piper?
Mother's Day in prison is a really tough day in women's prison. I was not a mother when I was incarcerated. And almost from literally from wake up, which is at 6 a.m. during the regular week, and I think you lights on at 9 on a Sunday. You get up, you're moving around your unit, whatever that is, and people start wishing you Happy Mother's Day because the odds are really good that you are a mom. They may not know. Not everyone is totally open about all their personal details when you're incarcerated, but the odds are good that you are a mom, and so it's safe to say that. And that is a challenging thing because the majority of moms who are locked up are the mothers of minor children, kids under the age of 18. And they may not be getting a visit that day. You know, here in New York, we incarcerate a huge number of women from the New York, the urban area of New York City, and almost all of those women are sent far upstate, far away from their kids. I was incarcerated in Connecticut, and it may not seem so far. I think it was about an hour and a half drive or so from my boyfriend, Larry, my now husband, Larry. But for a poor family from the Bronx to get on subways and trains and cabs, and if you've got more than one kid to herd, suddenly it becomes this incredible challenge, even to go a relatively short distance up to Danbury, up to Bedford Hills, which are not as far as Albion, which is way upstate. So that particular Mother's Day in Danbury, in prison in 2004, in the federal system, a lot of women had crocheted these beautiful long-stemmed red roses that they were giving to the women who were important to them within that setting. And of course, within women's prison, one of the things I wrote about in the book is these family units that you find when you're incarcerated. And so there is this incredible focus on that maternal relationship, even though sometimes it's an adoptive maternal relationship.
Now, you were in a low security prison. Where you were was different, Donna. How was it?
Drastically different. Excuse my voice, I had laryngitis, but I say good to speak to you tonight. So, where I was. So, Bedford Hills, even though it's the only maximum security prison for women in New York State, happens to be one of the smallest prisons in New York State, and it just happens to be for women. So, we had this micro world within itself in the prison, and when the holidays came around, I think everyone knows, like, women, we share so much emotion. We're very emotional, and certain times of the month we're even more emotional. So imagine hundreds of women going through these emotions on any given day. So for it to be a holiday or like Mother's Day, it's words can't even describe how. Words can't describe. Because sad to say, like Piper said, that a lot of the women come from the urban areas in New York City. And so that means for Black and brown people, like women in prison. And so for that family structure, it's usually torn apart immediately. There's no opportunity given for mother and child to bond. It's very hard. You have to fight for it. And so the women are often, including myself, because that happened to me, that wondering, where's my child or my children? What are they doing? Oh, it just comes right back to you, like, oh my God, what am I here? Why am I here? What happened? And so it's kind of re-traumatizing in a way, because you relive everything that's ever happened or what brought you to prison, and you're supposed to find some joy in it, and to be, it's Mother's Day. So, to try to combat that, we do form families in prison. And so I had a series of mothers, and I was thankful for that, because I didn't have a mother that cared anyway. Two mothers in my life didn't care anyway. So it was good to have that, and to try to block out all the emotions and do my best to not focus on what was happening to my daughter, or not happening for her. So you try to make the best of it, as best as you can. You try to make the best of it, but it's a very difficult time.
Elizabeth?
I was wondering if you remember the moment, either of you, when prior to whatever the crime was that you participated in, if there was a moment that half second before that decision got made, or it sounds like it might not have even been a decision, I was just wondering if you can remember back to that moment when, after the act, you could never retrieve the previous moment. And did you feel a sense of, what am I doing? Or was it just this sort of cascade of events that really couldn't be stopped or even recognized when it was happening? So I was wondering, Donna and then Piper, if that is a salient question. It's just one I wonder about. Obviously, I've never been put in prison, but I've definitely done things that I couldn't take back.
Thanks for that question. I think as you saw in the film that was shown, that I spoke on being 19 years old and being caught up into a situation that I took responsibility for even allowing myself to become a part in any kind of way in that act, because I did. Did I mean for the act itself to be, I didn't even know. No, I did not. I didn't mean for anyone to die. I didn't mean kidnapping. That was way out of my control and not even something that was even in my thoughts. I didn't see that because that's not what was presented to me. But I'm fully accountable for saying that I would be involved in a black male scheme, because that's what it was. And so when it just blew up the way it did, I just didn't understand it. And I think what happened to me, now I don't think I know, what happened for me, being a child and a young woman that was so abused, that I disassociated. I had to disassociate so I could survive, so I could get through it, because I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know. And so I had to remove myself from the situation. My body was in it, but my mind was someplace else. And that's how I went through it. And there was a point where, and I can say this, that Mr. V, because I call his name, because he's carried with him every day, asked for help. I didn't know how to help him, because that little girl didn't know how to help herself. That young woman didn't know that teenager didn't know how to help herself. So how could I help anybody else? And to be honest, I actually thought for a moment, I'm thankful it's not me this time. I thought that. But why did I think that? Because of all the stuff that I've been through that nobody helped me with. No one that I came across, no one that I went to for help, gave enough or considered it be worthy enough to help. And so I didn't know how to help the next human being. And so I think about those things, and that's why I do what I do today, because I don't ever want another young person, young woman, child, to go through that, to be stuck in that, not know how to navigate through that. It's just wrong.
I was in my early 20s when I committed my crime. I carried a bag of money, drug money, from Chicago to Brussels. And by the time I was asked to do that, I already had passed this point where I felt like I was in completely over my head. And the interesting thing about my thought process at the time was that I was so focused on being an adult. I was 22 years old. I was an adult, right? I was a young person. I was certainly past the age of legal responsibility. But I really felt like I had to solve my own problems. I was in a very isolated place in terms of my decision making. There's an I rating on that because, unlike Donna, if I had asked for help, I'm quite certain I would have gotten it. And that's a tragic thing, that I didn't ask for help when I needed it. In terms of the literal, arc of that crime of carrying that bag of money, which obviously took place over, an international flight and so on and so forth, there were many stopping points of total panic, like when the bag went missing because I had checked it. I was instructed to check it. That wasn't my call. When I thought about running, and I thought, if I run, I'll was no question that by the time that journey was over, that I had completely crossed a line that could not be uncrossed.
Do you, yeah.
Because it's risky talking.
Go for it.
Risky to interrupt.
Absolutely.
Your answers were both really beautiful, but I think the question is so wrong, Elizabeth, because the question is not, what do individuals do that means that they should be locked up? The question is, what are the crimes this country is committing that means that we're locking up so many people? And also, that for the most part, the kinds of things that people have done to go to prison are punished if you're a person of color and not if you're a rich white person. And if you don't have any other proof of it, let's look at what's happening with the cops who kill all the time and get no punishment. So I'm sorry, I'm so upset by that question. We did a teach-in.
Laura, we're gonna continue this conversation, okay?
Okay.
And we're just beginning. We're just beginning. This is Laura Whitehorn, who has a personal experience of this very situation, and I'm really glad you're here. And thank you for what you have to say. No, don't apologize for anything.
Well, Laura,
We're gonna go for it.
Laura, could I ask a question that might need me, it might not? Is there a crime that hasn't been named yet that you could think of
Something in private.
that should be inflicted in a fair manner?
I mean,
Or
something
should
that,
be designated as an actual and not
is
perhaps,
there something that should be a crime that isn't?
that is not a crime yet?
Well, first let me say, everything in this country has become a crime.
Yeah.
Walking across the street is a crime. If you jaywalk, if you walk a little crooked, that's a crime. I mean, especially if you're a person of color, to speak for Laura's saying. So, for me, I can't even, there's no way to wrap my head around that, of like, what is a legitimate crime or not, because, like I sat here and said that I took full, and I continue to take full responsibility for, getting involved in my actions. But does it warrant the time I did?
Well, that was gonna be my question, is do
That,
you feel
I
like
think-
your punishment
I
fit the
think we
crime?
need to look at that, like how long, how much, when is enough enough, right? I mean, there are people, I went into prison in 1985. There are people in there that were there when they were 17 and 16 years old, in 1979. I left them there. When is enough enough? And people can look at it, oh, well, this person did so much, and this. But that one act, we have allowed ourselves, this country has allowed ourselves to define a person by one act. One act, and that's it. That's a crime.
How do you think about your punishment, Vibrant? How do you think about your punishment? Do you think it fit the crime?
I can only think about my punishment not in sort of the abstract or in isolation, but in relation to other people's, right? It's all relational. So it's very hard to protest my sentence when I was doing time with other women who, rather than my 15-month sentence, had sentences of 5 years, 10 years, 15 years for totally comparable offenses. And the clear-cut difference was socioeconomic, and in some cases the color of their skin.
Yeah.
So that's the first way that I think about my punishment and my sentence. It would be hard to persuade me that my sentence as it was designed served a lot of purpose for the public good in terms of preventing new crime, in terms of serving as a deterrent for other people's choices. It seems hard to believe that I don't think that it prevented any new crime, and I'm very skeptical about whether my sentence itself deterred anyone else's actions. So, a 25-year sentence is purely punitive. No one should have any illusion that there's anything rehabilitative about a 25-year sentence. My observation would be that there's very little rehabilitation going on behind the walls of any prison or jail, or very, very few. the value of punishment. What value does it have to us as a society? What value does it have to us as people? A sentence serves several functions. It punishes, and a really interesting thing that a psychologist said to me, who specializes in altruism and punishment, those are his areas of study, and he said, for a punishment to be satisfying to the punisher, it has to hurt. And incarceration really hurts. So the flip side of like what productive purpose does it serve? Like what moral purpose does the punishment serve? And on some level, victims of crime have to answer that question and have the opportunity to answer that question in a really meaningful way, as opposed to an incredibly limited way, which is, I mean, I have not been victimized in any significant way by crime, but I do think that victims of crime have to have the opportunity to be part of the conversation and really inform a way that accountability for harm caused is possible without cages.
I mean, I have a long list of people that I think should be punished. A very long list. It includes several former presidents, a lot of people who have, in their own personal possession, wealth equal to, half the population of the world. I think there's about 85 of those people. I think that should be a crime. I would love to hear, Laura, your answer to that question, and other people think about what should be a crime that isn't. Displacement, theft, theft of native lands, among other things, theft of labor for hundreds of years. It's a long list. And at the same time, I have a question about, well, what's an appropriate response? An appropriate response to those crimes? An appropriate response to other crimes? Based on your experience, I don't know whether, Laura, you actually do want to answer that question, but based on your experience, what do you think is an appropriate way? What would have been an appropriate or effective way to deal with you, as it were, Donna?
Well, I think I've mentioned that I was failed before I even got to the
Talk a little bit more about that.
prison system. So I was supposedly adopted, but I found out I was sold. So the adoption system failed me. Then I was being molested, raped by my adopted father. After about 3 years of going through it, I was 12, started at 9. I went to school, I was tired. I needed help. I went to tell, and the counselor called my mother, who happened to be a director of state mental health facilities. So she knew what to do and what to say. And they made me into a liar. So a little 12-year-old became a liar. She was already damaged many years ago. So I started introverting. I just became closed in. I was still excelling at school because I just happened to be smart, thank God. It would have been worse at home if it wasn't. But then I just couldn't take it, and so I ran away. So I ran away, I was 14, I ran away with the first man that was 11 years my senior, just needed help. So I looked at him as a knight in shining armor. He was one of my worst abusers. I went to the police to help me. The police raped me. And then I got caught up into the scheme that eventually became this crime of the century. Well, as I said, I take responsibility for that. And then nowhere in the judicial system, now the court system, did anyone look at me. It was all about the crime, rightfully so. It was all about not even the victim, Mr. Vick. It wasn't even about him, because I happened to have gone in front of a judge who was in a movie deal for his book. I think everyone knows Carlito's Way. So he was too busy with all that. He was busy. And so I got lost. I don't know who else got lost, but I know I got lost because my story was never told. It was never like, why did she even get here? Because the defense was duress and coercion. So that means a person, is forced to do something against their will and whatever. It's like the Stockholm syndrome. But no one ever paid that any mind. It didn't matter. So my life didn't matter. And neither did the victim's life. Mr. V's life didn't matter. I know that now, looking backwards. And so all those systems, and then I went into the and things happen there. So all those systems failed me. Now, I didn't come from a ghetto. I wasn't brought to this country into a ghetto. I was born into a very residential, upper middle class environment. My mother was the director of the mental health facilities in this state. My so-called father was a World War II veteran, decorated. But where was I in there? No one cared about all that. They used that to just shut me up. I had one of the highest scholarships in this city. One of the highest scholarships. That was in the papers. No one paid that any mind. What happened to that girl that was out there that just started cutting class and running away? And what happened? No one even looked for me when I ran away. No one looked for me. School didn't know I was missing. The scholarship that I had to one of the most prestigious high schools, eventually college. No one looked. What's wrong with us? That we don't care. That we don't pay attention to that. Something's wrong there. So I say society, and I'm not throwing the blame out as a whole, but society, we have a way of failing ourselves, especially our children.
Can I try another question? So I think I'm interested in just the emotionalism and the psyche and whatever happens. Once you find yourself in a situation, how does the human mind contend with? So you're in prison, each of you, for different reasons at different times. And is it possible? My question is, in any given situation, can you look at a moment, even no matter how horrible that moment is, no matter how unfair, people inflicting, is there a way to cut like an instant, a moment, a minute? Are you able to find some autonomy in those synapses so you can be true to yourself no matter what's happening to you in ways that you can't control? Because I'm wondering, were you able to access that self-will, that self-decision, that emotion to find bits of personal freedom in the most horrendous situation that you found yourself in?
I think that the experience of incarceration is all about the struggle for regaining some sense of control over your own life. Because you enter prison, everything about the way the individual who runs that system treats you and the system as a whole treats you is about taking away your control over everything. When you eat, when you sleep, if you can have any contact with the outside world, every moment is seemingly controlled. And so everything about the experience of incarceration to me is about the fight to regain some sense of control. And that is a struggle that can take you in very positive directions and very negative directions. Because control means different things to different people. So you see some people seek to control and manipulate other people when they're incarcerated. You see some people struggle to find some positive way to have control over their life in whatever limited way is possible. For me, control of my own physical body was incredibly important because, they can take everything from you, but you do have all you have is your body and your mind. And so those two things were incredibly important. That's to me every step of the way. And you do see people who seem to have given up that fight to regain some sense of control over their lives. People throw around the term institutionalized a lot. It's a big insult. If you're locked up and you call somebody else so institutionalized, those are fighting words, exactly. Because that means you've given up the fight, right? You've given up the fight to regain some sense of control, of your own world.
Well, what about our fight? What about our fight and our autonomy in this current situation? We act as if it's inevitable what's going on in our kind of incarcerating society. And yet ours is a very different reality from every other country in the world. Our 2.2 million number incarcerated in prison, not including the people in juvenile detention and the people on parole and the people on probation, which gets us up into 7, 8, 9 million. We lead the world. Why? Can you talk a little bit about what choices we've made as a society, what decisions we've made to bring us here. And when you hear the numbers like the 900% increase in women in prison since the 1970s, the fastest growing group, what accounts for that? Are women committing more crimes? Oh.
Or will they commit more crimes?
What choices are we making that brought us here?
So, to relate it to my story, I think what my story resonates with a lot of our stories, right? We were talking before, and we had very similar, situations, maybe in a different way, because I happen to be a brown-colored woman, right? Viper is white-colored woman. But, that, for me, if maybe I was just a tinge lighter, I don't know what it would have been to, somebody could have helped me, and maybe, I don't know. But women, I noticed, we have a lot of women. It's not just inside prison, but women in general. And if we don't speak about it, I know it's happening. A large majority of women in this country are being abused in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Be it at work, being in the household, be just walking down the street. I mean, there are many forms of abuse. There's many forms of disrespect. There's so many forms of things. And so we're treated differently. When I went into the prison system, the rules and regulations, the policy and procedures said he. And I said, well, where am I in there? The clothes were made by men for men and worn by women. We had to figure that one out. Everything. And so out here, it's the same thing. And not as an insult or slight to the gentleman in the room, but let's be honest. Let's be honest. We look at women differently. You should not even have autonomy at all. You shouldn't stand up for yourself. You shouldn't speak up for yourself. You should be barefoot, pregnant, and in the kitchen. And that's it. And when I'm ready for you, be ready. That's how it's always been thrown at me. And so the more we try to stand up and to fight for what's ours, what was the bra burning thing for? What was that about? Right? But I'm just saying those things that this country has gone through, other countries go through now. Genital mutilation. What is that about?
But no other country is seeing a spike in incarceration like what we've seen in the last 30
Because
years.
everything is so punitive. Everything here, like we were saying before, just walking across the street in a different angle, you can consider that jaywalking. And so we want to criminalize everything. We have become so punitive that we don't see any good in anyone. We don't see any good in ourselves. And so we don't see any good in anyone. And that's why. That shouldn't be. Norway, look at their system. It's the most humane, one of the most humane systems. I mean, other countries, our whole entire population of people that are incarcerated, in combination with the world, it still exceeds. And that just doesn't make any sense. When are we going to stop? So it's really, to answer that question, I think everyone needs to take the mirror out and look at themselves, because everyone plays a part. Everyone has a voice. When I go and I speak to people, I say, you have a voice. You vote. You have a voice. Let the person that you vote reflect you.
But for decades, and I'd love you to come in on this too, is people have voted for people who promised to get tough on crime. We've done it here in New York City.
In practical terms, we know the history. So in the 80s, there was a first pass of drug policy, and then in 1994, again, there was a massive federal crime bill that ratcheted up our reliance on policies, which we know have failed us, if in fact they were intended to control, to address substance abuse and addiction. And of course, I'm talking about, the war on drugs, which sent millions and millions and millions of Americans to prison. The narcotics that those laws were supposed to address are cheaper, more potent, more readily available today than when we put those laws in the books. So we started sending all these people to prison that we wouldn't have sent to prison before. We started sending them to prison for much longer periods of time, much harsher sentences, including things like 25-year sentences for nonviolent drug crimes. And we also started sending people back to prison much more quickly. So many people are sent back to prison not because they commit new crimes, but because they drop dirty on a drug test when they're on parole, or they fail to show up for an appointment with their probation officer. So those revocations of people's, tentative freedom are much more frequent. And those things add up to this massive population of people in prison. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, of course, why did we tolerate that? Why did we keep voting for people? And I think that you must acknowledge the incredibly entwined history that the criminal justice system has with racial control and the establishment and maintenance of racial hierarchy. Because that's why we've tolerated it. Because the people that we were sending to prison overwhelmingly were disproportionately black, brown, poor. And look, racial inequality was once the law of the land in the form of slavery, in the form of new Jim Crow laws. And the criminal justice system enforced those laws. And we know that from the history of law enforcement's involvement in lynching. We know that when we watch those videos of Sheriff Bull Connor turning fire hoses and German Shepherds on little black children. But, the shit hasn't changed that much. So, that's in terms of why did we continue with this policy? Why did we tolerate this policy? As more and more parties drew more and more benefit from this enormous prison population, it's because we had modified all of these black and brown bodies.
I was curious about this dialectic between academics like Kim Crenshaw, Bethany Ritchie, Michelle Alexander, and the practitioners, the people who have experienced prison, who are dealing with the notion between I am watching this, collecting data, analyzing what this means in the society, and versus this has happened to me. It's sort of like the difference between the worm's eye view and the eagle eye view. And I was just very curious as to, do you collaborate with the theorists, or do you have something in you that feels sort of like, oh, what this is like? Do you, in the art world, I'm a practitioner of extreme action, space, time, forces, body, but the theorists in performance studies at NYU don't necessarily think I have any information. So there's no dialogue from the experiential practitioner versus the actual academic who sits around there. So all those people talking about what this means, I just was very curious. You guys ever just admire them, or do you wake up and go, oh, what the hell are you talking about? That's
I'm so grateful. Beth Ritchie has written about black women and violence, and Michelle Alexander has, of course, authored this sort of incredibly clarifying description of reality. I think one of the reasons that the New Jim Crow has found so many readers from so many different walks of life is because Dr. Alexander described what we all sort of knew was there, but she gave it this crystalline argument and description. And I'm just so grateful. And I think all of those folks that you mentioned, and many other, folks who have not been incarcerated themselves but are doing the work of helping inform policymakers of their tragic mistakes. And also, I do think Dr. Alexander is a good example of someone who is actively involved in organizing. Because to me, at the end of the day, there's a lot of different moving parts to creating change. One thing is raising up the voice and the political strength of the people who are most affected by this problem. And that, you can't actually achieve real change without doing that. Because we're impatient for change, we also have to do the work of persuading elites and getting people who draw a lot of benefit from the status quo to move off of that for some reason. We have to come up with the most compelling reasons, whether it be pressure or persuasion. But there's no substitute for the authentic voice of the lived experience. And absent that, and I think that has, until relatively recent times, been very absent from this conversation, it's hard to imagine more silenced people than incarcerated people. and to a slightly lesser extent, formerly incarcerated.
Do they rush up to you, talk to you, want to meet with you often, these academics? Do you know what I mean?
It depends on the academic. It depends, because, you know, to piggyback with Piper, you have to have a level playing field. Everyone has to be on the same page. So you can't really conduct this research, study, survey, anything, without the voice of who you're researching or studying, surveying in it, or with you. You know, it's a collective. The only way to change anything is to come together and do it collectively. You know, that's how I've noticed that things have changed throughout, you know, this country, any country, you know, over the course of any history. So we all have to come together and work together to do that. And so to have, you know, a researcher to perform research, who are you talking to? One thing that I've noticed, I think I said this to you earlier, was that women were not in the narrative completely at all. But why? We have the fastest growing population of incarcerated women in the world.
We incarcerate 1/3 of all the women in the world who are locked up here in this country.
So why are we not more in the conversation? Why are we not in the narrative more? We should be. And so that's why Piper and I do what we do. And I told her, I said, well, I wasn't intrigued with Orange is the New Black when I first heard about it. I wasn't. I told her, right? So because I was like, well, another one. Because I never saw anything that related to me. I told my story. I told the story to anybody else that I knew. But then, you know, I had to give it, so, you know, I had to look at it. I had to read it, and I had to open myself up because I had gotten angry after a while. I had gotten so, you know, just, well, what about us? Where are we? Why don't you see us? Why won't you hear us talk? And so, you know, Orange is the New Black allows that. It opens a door for this conversation. I'm sure a lot of you are here because of Piper. You know what I mean? And that's great. Let's be real. That's great. I'm not there yet. But we need it. So if you take anything away, take that away. She's a real person. She wrote a book about her realness, her reality. And it turned into a series, which is great, but it's real.
Your work's not there's a film in the works about you, or a project. I mean, we do live in a very bizarre society, right? Where we have no films about the crimes of the torturers and the slaveholders, but we do have a fascination with prison stories, with crime, true life crime. Everything you've said about the importance of penetrating the public consciousness with real stories obviously is critical, but it's treacherous. How are you going to negotiate?
I don't know.
Any advice?
Somebody give me some. I told her to stay in touch. For real. But, you know, it's hard. For real, because I want to tell this. My story is not my story. When I have my people here with me, and I tell them, I wouldn't have said okay to do it if it wasn't going to stay true to what I know it to be. And so, and it's not just about me. I have people in the audience now who served time with me, who when they left, looked back and helped me out and were there for me. And so those stories I want people to know. I want them to know that there was a 17-year-old in prison in 1979 who was there now, who was impregnated by a correctional officer, and she has a daughter because of it, and she's still in there now, regardless of whatever she did. But she's still there now. When is enough enough? Her daughter will be 21, and she's going on 53. When is enough enough? And there's so many stories. Judy Clark. When is enough enough for driving a car like I did? So many. You know, these are my friends, these are my family. So when I tell that story in that movie, it's not just about me, because it's not me. I am everybody, everyone.
But there are pitfalls, right, Doctor?
Yes, there are.
I think the thing that I recognized in the course of publishing the book, which came out in 2010, and then of course this process of adaptation is a fascinating and a strange one. But something that I realized, whoa! That's right.
See that coming.
Deep in the moment.
That was great.
Something that I realized even before the show came out, just with the book, which, you know, you have authorship, total authorship of a book, right? You can say, every word in that book I wrote. You know, those are my opinions, my thoughts, etc. But the thing that I recognized in the course of meeting readers and talking to them about what they took away from the book, what they took away from the book had so much to do with what they brought to the book. And I recognized for myself that the minute that that book was published, that story was not entirely mine anymore, because now it really belonged to them. Like, it was my gift to them on a lot of levels. Like, and I couldn't control what they would find interesting, what they would take away, what they might miss in this, or I would think they would miss. But I had to trust in the authenticity of the story, and the truth of the story that you tell is important. But it is also, you know, this gift that you give to the reader, to the audience, to whoever it is who is interested in it. And they bring all kinds of stuff to the reading or the watching or the listening or whatever your art form is, and they take away all kinds of things that sometimes really surprise you. So that has been an instructive lesson to me.
All right, I'm about to come out and ask other people to pose their questions, and we have buckets of people's answers to the question of what confines you. But I do have a question around how do we move from here to this other place, to somewhere better? Can this system be reformed? If ours is a state that has incarceration so deeply embedded in it for so many people, how do we unravel that? How do you unravel the state of mass incarceration? And do you have any glimpses in the work that you're doing of that unraveled, decarcerated state? You know? A lot of questions there. I will start roaming if you would like to answer some of those questions.
Take all the guns away from all the cops. That's my one idea.
Start with
And
gun
don't
control.
ever, the issue of women as victims turned accused of being criminals, the very same thing. Understand that women really never do anything bad and never take them to prison again, and close all women's prisons. So those are my two very interesting ideas.
Are those for us?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because those
But
are
I'd love your answers. How do we decarcerate?
like,
The bucket, are those for us?
just the answer
Yes.
to the question.
Oh, good question. Yeah. There are so many people who are incarcerated who have incredibly profound problems which should be dealt with in the public health system. And this is true whether you're talking about mental health, whether you're talking about substance abuse, whether you're talking about trauma from the survival of violence. And so that to me is potentially one of the most important leverage points, is to recognize that we have cascaded money and energy into one public system, this criminal justice system, when it should really be cascading and directed into a much more useful public system, which is the public health system. That's an opportunity, because I'm a realist, like in terms of, you know, how do we decarcerate? What's a practical idea around problem solving? And there are so many very serious problems that confront communities that end up lodged in the criminal justice system, even though they don't belong there.
To piggyback again, there are many alternatives than incarceration. So we have some programs that people don't even know exist that are alternatives to the ATIs, alternative incarceration programs. And one in particular, my mother, I call my mother Sister Mary Nerney, she created the movement, started the movement for domestic violence and awareness in this state and subsequently in this country. And, you know, it's called Steps to End Family Violence. And what the program does is intervene when a woman has gotten to the point where she couldn't take the abuse anymore, that she reacted. And so she happened to kill her abuser, right? Because she's been abused for maybe 17, 20-some years out of her life. And so that program steps in to assist, to try to find alternatives and stuff. I mean, that's what we should think about, things like that. We should think about alternatives. For this kid who was adopted, right, and who subsequently became abused, was being abused, raped, at 9. Where were the interventions? The signs were there. We see the signs every day. We look. We really, really look and honest with ourselves that we see it. Intervene. We see these stories about children every day being hurt. And they saw it in school. They saw it in daycare. They saw it. So why doesn't anyone do anything? We can intervene. It doesn't have to go all the way to prison. Why does that child have to then become incarcerated when they're in their teens or in their 20s? Because they didn't have anyone there to help. They didn't have a way out. We should have some intervention way before that. Now, I'll say, granted, there are some people who need to be put away, but usually they're mental health reasons. Prisons have now replaced the mental health facilities in this state more than anyone, and in this country overall. It doesn't
Brian
make any
Stevenson has
sense.
a number in his book, Just
Yes.
Mercy. I think it's 50% of people who are serving time right now
Yes, they
have a
close
mental
down
handicap.
mental health facilities, but want to open up more prisons or flood the prisons. That's not a fix.
Let me see some more hands. I've got 1, 2, give me a few more. 3, 4, 5. Well, let's start over here and then I'll move over there.
I'll take a few questions and then we'll get on.
I'd be interested to know, okay, sure. I understand that a lot of the prisons are now run as private corporations as opposed to government institutions. And I wonder if this is something you've thought about or you've talked about a lot amongst yourselves. And I understand that there are even quota systems, that when governments turn certain prisons over, that they commit a number, that they'll keep those prisons full for the corporate profit.
Yeah.
So what role does
So there's a small
Profit
handful
motive
of
plan.
private prison corporations. GEO Group, Corrections Corporation of America is the biggest. It has a very intimate relationship with the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The Management and Training Corporation is the number 3. And they sign contracts with the federal government or with state governments to operate prisons on their behalf. Sometimes they own those facilities. Sometimes they're running, a building that is owned by the state. And yes, whenever they can, they demand bed guarantees. And it's very easy for most people to see how perverse it is to place profit at the center of a public safety decision. I think it's really important to remember that, obviously those private prison corporations that actually literally operate prisons draw the most benefit from having a lot of people in prison, but so do private healthcare corporations, which operate very widely. So does Aramark, which doesn't just sell food at the stadiums or, in God forbid your kid's school, but also provides food for many, many prisons and jails. And so this sort of widening pool of people who draw great, great benefit out of, the incarceration of overwhelmingly poor people and people of color, has to be looked at really hardly, so, really intently. And, there has to be a clear-cut community decision about whether we think that's acceptable.
And to add to the picture of the for-profit prisons, we have our public funds being substituted in a period of public funding cuts. We learned from Ferguson, we're learning now all across the country, that in fact our city budgets are being in part substituted by the fines that are being charged, usually paid by the poorest people. So we've also got a public motive to keep incarceration going on.
Good evening. I just wanted to make a statement. I am one of the government stakeholders in the criminal justice system as we speak. I think, my name is Dr. Vonda Seawood. I am currently working at the Kings County District Attorney's Office, but just a couple of months ago, I was one of the executives for New York State Parole. I want to say when we talk about the research and we talk about the work that's being done in the community, we really have to separate the two. Because when we talk about the research, that's a bunch of people who are looking for numbers that only the federal government's going to look at in order to determine where they should put funding. I think when we talk about the work that needs to be done on the ground, we have to bring the people who have been through this experience to the table, because we have to, as we like to say, change the tires on the car as the car is moving. So as we're sitting in a think tank talking about something that's going to be published 10 years from now, there are tens and thousands of people coming out of prison that need services right now. So we don't have time to wait for that. The other thing I wanted to say is that someone asked, how do we change this? It is about the politicians. You, me, we hear tough on crime and we say, yeah, that's the person. But we decipher really closely when they start talking about raising your real estate tax or raising your personal income tax. You have to listen to what do they mean by tough on crime, and usually that means incarceration. That's exactly what that means. And if you want to save your tax dollars, you would stop letting them incarcerate these people, because having worked for New York State Department of Corrections for many years, it's not helping anybody at all.
Thank you. Here.
You got me? Okay. Hi. My brother and I have a project working with the community, and we work a little bit on Rikers Island with RNDC, the emotionally sort of 15, 16, 17-year-old boys, and with Rosie's, with the girls. And we're really, I mean, it's been some of the most emotional and amazing experiences of our life. And I'm really interested in this idea of internship opportunities and possibly employment opportunities for some of these people that we're meeting, but I'm a little scared by that. And I'm scared because it's like, because they're in the criminal justice system and there's such a stigma against it, and I don't know, I guess I'm just a little scared by it, and I want to do it, but I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about entering the workforce again, and if things like that, like the working with Rosie's, working with the women in Rosie's was like, I mean, amazing. The women there are amazing, completely amazing.
Are there other people here who would like to help him with his question?
So,
I was going to say, Fonda,
you know what, it's like,
I think that right now in this room, there's a lot of women that have been incarcerated. You have a lot of women that are professors, that are in the caucus in Columbia University, that are working for the criminal justice field. I myself was incarcerated many years ago, been home 20 years, and I give back. I'm an advocate for victims of domestic violence. I got into the field with my sister Donna, you know, so, you know, everybody deserves a second chance, and stigma is what stops people from giving that person a second chance. I don't think you should be afraid.
cool. Yeah, I just am, you know? Yeah, no,
Like she said, if I didn't tell you I was incarcerated, would you be afraid of me? If you
No,
because
that's
looks
the
can be
thing. It's like
deceiving.
when you're in there and you're working with these women, it's like man on deck.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
man on deck.
I understand, but
That's
I
normal.
also myself have been home 20 years, and we've known each other since we were teenagers. And I'm a KSAC counselor, and I work with the youth. So looks can be deceiving, and there's nothing to be afraid of.
Great.
You want to come back on that too? I think my place, there's a mic right behind you.
I think you need to evaluate what are you fearful of.
yes.
And the reason why I say that is because, as these two young ladies said, there is a host of people in this audience that are formerly incarcerated that you don't have a clue. You may have given them a smile. They may have shaken your hand. There are the same people that are sitting in this room. They just did one or two things wrong that they're inside. I would suggest that, I don't have my business cards with me, but I will give you my information. We need to do a tour and go down to Women's Prison Association so that you can sit and talk with some people who are in the community. What's on the inside is the same thing on the outside. It's just that they look cute On the outside, they're dressed up and they're ready to go. There is no different. If they have an angry attitude inside, it doesn't mean they're gonna have an angry attitude outside. It's just trauma to the 10th power.
And I think
Wait,
actually,
let's bring in some other people. Thank you so much for your honesty.
Well, this is probably sort of relevant because my boyfriend spent 5 months at Rikers Island, and he was my ex when he went there, and we got back together after he got out. So if you think it's a risk to hire somebody, imagine getting back together with your ex. But on that note, I just wanted to ask about the stigma and how that plays into getting people to talk about their experiences, because it's one thing to speak to a reporter and then have your name show up in Google as someone who spent 9 months in prison, and that affects whether or not you can rent an apartment or get a job. And is there a solution to that, to bringing more stories into the media, but without having that have repercussions for the people who speak to reporters?
Well, I think we focus so much on how we're going to look to people that we've lost ourselves somewhere. If I focus on how I would be perceived, because you know that I was incarcerated for 27 years, then I couldn't be as effective as I am. I couldn't be me, the woman that I am today. I would still be that little girl, that broken, twisted, hurt, angry kid. That's not who I am. So I have to take the autonomy and just, this is who I am today, and you're going to accept me or you're not. People are going to accept you or they're not, regardless if you have time, you've spent time in prison or jail or whatever. You have to make a stance for yourself and say, this is who I am, and to be confident in that, and to be steadfast in that, and just be focused. I came out here after almost 30 years in prison, focused and determined. Nothing and no one, I would allow nothing and no one to stop me ever again. I was tired. I was tired. And I continue to be tired, not just for me, but for everybody else that I left inside. Because it just is the right thing to do. Just do the right thing. I think we all know what the right thing is to do. And if it means standing up and standing up for yourself, well, damn it, do it for the first time. It doesn't matter. Someone's going to accept you.
More questions? Thank you. Hi, I also have laryngitis, so I'm with you, Donna. But I have a question I have to ask. I noticed this week that the Obama administration took the opportunity to highlight their program, My Brother's Keeper, in the face of the problems with the Baltimore Police Department. And I wonder if there are people in this room that would have any thoughts, recommendations, advice for the Obama administration on what they are putting out as some way to address the race issues in our country. A federal initiative to funnel our tax dollars to support young men and boys of color, and to leave girls and young women out of that. So I just wonder if anyone would want to go on camera and talk about what they might recommend.
The prospects of young men and boys of color are particularly dire. We know that. We know that from looking at our history. We know that from certainly paying attention to the news over the last year has been particularly unusually, finally focused. But we also know that there are many young women of color who have experienced very similar things, whose names are not, becoming common currency and frontline news. Addressing the incredible gulf, in terms of opportunity for young people of color, particularly young people of color who live in communities that, for one reason, in a variety of ways, may be cut off from opportunities that may be right across town, and yet still, young people don't get the opportunities that they deserve, is a problem. I teach writing now in a medium security men's prison, and I've got 12 guys in my class. They range in age from, young, like in their early 20s, to their 50s. And all of them have crimes that are labeled crimes of violence, so there is a huge range in terms of, the kind of stuff that they're locked up for. I do think that there is a particular value to addressing the problems that men have that result in violence. And I don't know if My Brother's Keeper, I don't know enough about that initiative to know if that will delve deep in that. Something that I'm so struck by every single Monday when I go to class, and the guys write about their own lives. They write about all kinds of fascinating things, included but not limited to some of their involvement in crime or in violence, or their experience in victimization by violence, because almost all of them have been the victims of violence too. I'm so struck by how those factors inform their concept of masculinity and their sense of self. And I'm also so struck by how much those traditional and ossified senses of masculinity inform the way that the correctional system itself is run. Back to your point that, we found ourselves wearing, men's clothes, built in prisons built to house men, in systems designed for men in a variety of ways. That system of masculinity deserves deconstruction. I don't know if that's the intention of the Obama administration's initiative or not, but it merits investigation and work.
First of all, okay, so you made a step towards addressing the problems within the inner city, right? With our black and brown men. So where are black and brown men that have been affected by the system, right? By these same issues that you want to talk about. It doesn't make sense to have a dialogue or have anything going without people who are directly affected, part of the conversation or involved. And I know enough to know, there's no one formerly incarcerated that's really in that My Brother's Keeper initiative to do anything. I'm sorry, but the black or brown guy who works on Wall Street is not going to be effective to the black or brown kid that's going through some stuff. It's just not. It just doesn't work that way. And then we can't change anything or do anything or say that we're making change or progress in this country if women are not in that narrative. It should be my brothers and sisters keepers or whatever, but it just doesn't make any sense because what affects the black and brown male and also Caucasian affects the same, a female. Because like Piper said, and it's true, and that's something that it really took me to understand and to learn that men have been abused too, continue to be abused, little boys. That's why they're where they're at, and that's why they're going through what they're going through. Because I use this analogy, Plato in the cave. If you don't show somebody a way out, or that there are options that are viable, then they don't know how to make that change, or to take that chance. So we need everyone in the conversation. It just won't work outside. It just won't. I don't see it working.
Any more questions on this side? And then I want to hear some of what confines you. And if you're curious for more on the My Brother's Keeper question, I've always said it's not the brothers that's the problem, it's the keepers. There's a lot on our show on that topic. So,
well, I was active in the 90s in homeless shelters, and I do know that almost all the women that are in homeless shelters at that time had been abused. I also know that most of the guards that worked in the city shelters were there to gain experience to go to prisons. So it was a very abusive environment. And in fact, what I think is we live in a culture of abuse. When you talk about stopping abuse in prisons, we abuse everything around us, our landscape, look at climate change. It's not a separate issue. It's really a whole issue about our whole culture is based on power and abuse, and I see it everywhere. I'm very sympathetic to what you say because I was in the shelters as an artist making art with people to give them self-representation for about 7 years. I myself have been victimized. I was raped. My rapist was never prosecuted. I've suffered many abuses, and none of those perpetrators have ever been penalized. And so it's really the inequality that we see all around us of who gets punished and who doesn't. And the injustices we see just walking out on the street. So I'm not sure how we can approach a singular societal problem, because it's really a symptom from what I see as I said, a whole culture of abuse.
Thank you for sharing that.
If I want to bring Laura and maybe Susie back into this conversation, because I want to remember the global and the systemic and the institutional, even as we also talk, very importantly, I think, about the personal and the question of relationships and connection and how can we close this distance and what can we do in the way of making incremental change, even as we think the whole system is wrong. So, I mean, I'd love you, Laura, just to sort of pick up a little bit on where you began, which is how do we do both of these jobs at the same time? Because sometimes I feel like when we're talking about bringing down the whole system, we're ignoring the people who are actually in it right now.
Well, I am sorry that I interrupted in the beginning. I don't usually do that, but it was, you asked me to because you said risk, you know. And I do think actually that we have to take risks in order to change the system because, you know, there's sort of this culture, which Piper was talking about if we lock up everyone, then we're safe. You know, it's like gated communities. It's like, I'm sorry, but what's going on in New York City, the gentrification and coming to Williamsburg, or going to where I live, Washington Heights, everywhere. We're making it impossible for third world people, for poor people to live in New York. And in order to change what is, I agree, it's not a separate system. The prison system is not separate from the rest of the government and from the rest of the state that we have acquiesced in living under. And so I think that there are really deep questions about race. I think that the whole question of whether you're afraid of people and whether people are stigmatized has to do with race. I think, Piper, I know you agree with me because this is what I loved in your book, is that your awareness that we as white, middle-class, educated people went to prison that way and came out, and we actually had a position that was more socially powerful than some of the guards that were abusing us at times, but you know, out on the street, that's a black woman and I'm a white woman. And if we don't question some of the deeper issues of racial control and colonialism in this country and in this system, and those are big systemic questions. On the other hand, there are ways to start. There are particular pressure points. So, for example, we haven't talked much about the police. I love your idea, Elizabeth, of disarming the police. I totally agree with that. But we haven't talked about one of the biggest bars to making change is the police and correctional officer unions, but also the fact that we idolize the police. In the last week, there was a guy killed, a construction worker. Another construction worker was killed in Midtown from some messed up, unsafe work site to build another skyscraper for rich people. And it was in the Times. It was a little, you know, as Susie said to me, yeah, it was, at least his name was in the Times. Usually it's not. And yet the police officer who got killed, and that is a loss of a life. I'm not saying it's not, but his life is so much more valued in this society. And people look at his job is dangerous. Well, that construction worker's job was dangerous too. So until we start really questioning, and that's why my biggest hope for change in the criminal justice system is the Black Lives Matter movement, because they, unlike my generation when we were fighting the cops who were killing people like Clifford Glover, they're talking about cops as representing state violence and not just some, you know, kind of weird kind of sense of racism that floats around. And the last thing I want to say, because I know I'm talking a lot, is, so in terms of prison reform in New York State, if we only look at mass incarceration and not the prison system that came before, and the system of permanent punishment that's at the root of it, we will not change anything. We'll just have a prettier system. We have to, and every time I read in the newspaper, low-risk, nonviolent prisoners should be let out, I say, well, actually, if you look at the numbers, the lowest risk for recidivism is in older people who've served a long time, who committed what? First-degree murder. And those are the people the parole board will not let out because they say the nature of the offense. So we have to do a lot of work and a lot of things, but one thing we definitely have to do is not let the reform take the form of let's let out the people who should never have been locked up before, because everyone agrees the drug war was.
The group, in fact, that's the fastest growing, I think, right now incarcerated are people 50 years and older. I mean, the greatest growing part of our prison population is 50 years and older. Another question here. Maybe there were two questions here. Let's start with Ms. Westside back here. Or you go for it.
Oh, sorry. You, my friend. I think I'm going to preface this with, I just came out of graduate school, did an entire project on cultural equity in the arts and sort of how the demographic is changing. So my brain is really sort of in that space and understanding terminology, understanding how to sort of approach things. Also at my work, we're going through a transition of putting diversity into our cross-cutting foci, and I work in a very white, waspy situation where politics is a big thing, and it's very uncomfortable for any of the people of color finding terminology to even deal with, the shift of, the white population is no longer going to be the majority. How do you sort of kind of talk about that stuff? So from that perspective, the things that I have come out with is, even as a woman of color, I have a lot of privilege. I have a strong enough voice. I have enough education to know when to speak up and when to say something, but I really recommend that you read this book about biases and understanding your privilege and your bias as to why you have that fear, because we're so socialized to think a certain way. I'm South Asian. South Asians hate black people. I don't know what it's about, but it's if I brought home a black boy, that's worse than bringing home a white boy. I don't know what it is, but I luckily have great parents, but for whatever reason, there are these stigmas that exist, and that it's, before I was born, those were there.
Thank you.
Right? So there's this idea also of advocacy. Everyone has a voice. You see something happening that's wrong, and if you speak up, we just stop doing that because we're staring at our phones or just trying to ignore what the issue is. But if you actually speak up for someone that's going through something or notice that something's wrong.
Thank you.
So it has to start with us. We can't just blame the system all the time. We have to blame ourselves. It's a two-party thing.
It starts with us.
Okay, my name's Lowen Kelly, and I just wanted to ask you a question about something I'm doing. I used to be in a different world in media and journalism, but I just started a couple months ago a new website that, hi Donna, that is called prisonwriters.com, and it's all prison writers. I have about 1,000 letters that people have written me in just a few months. And men, women, not enough women, not enough people who've just gotten out. For some reason, I guess, well, they don't really know much. They don't know about it. That's probably the reason. But anyway, it's easy to find prisoners. My question is, there's a lot of talk about we need to know these prisoners and know their stories and understand, humanize them, for a cliche word. But, what do you think more can be done with just plain, here are all these stories, hundreds of them. What more can we do, or I can do with this idea to really get the word out? Thanks.
Can I? Yeah?
Absolutely.
Yeah, awesome. I'm thrilled that you're doing that. That's wonderful. Back to your earlier questions about those academics, my experience over the past 10 years since I came home from prison is every time I encounter an academic, they're frustrated that their research isn't getting the attention of the people they want, or enough attention. And I'm like, well, that's because there's no stories. And so the stories are incredibly, incredibly important because they offer the access point for lots of different kinds of people to try and understand other people. And I always say that when you allow yourself to be truly connected to other people, that's when inequality becomes intolerable and you have to do something about it. One thing you can think about, I don't know what form sort of your work takes, but everything you can do as sort of the repository or keeper of that work to make it as accessible as possible to lots of other different kinds of readers. And some of that means like slicing and dicing it via topic or subject or what kind of story is it. It's important not to forget about things like genre, because actually those things are incredibly resonant to readers or to people who are interested in taking stories in. And I think the thing that I noticed that is a challenge for many people who are, they may not be novice storytellers, because like certainly every person I ever knew who was locked up had a ton of awesome, fascinating, sometimes heartbreaking, sometimes hilarious stories, just fascinating stories. But, making sure that those stories go into a narrative framework that is, again, accessible to a reader or a listener or whatever form they take is really important, because I think that can be a stumbling block between the teller and the hearer or the reader. And those things are really important.
Do you want to read any of the little what confines you comments?
Yeah,
Because we're running out of time. This conversation has gone by so fast. I want to get some of those answers in.
Donna, do you want to read yours?
Yeah, the first one that I pulled, I was like, this one says rule of law. So I thought that was like really.
But who makes it?
Yeah, whose law, whose rule?
What is some of the other one?
So the other one was New York real estate prices. I thought you found it. He said, the pressures and expectations of society, family, friends, and myself. It's very true.
Piper, you have some more there?
Yeah, I have some that are similar. I have one that says, not knowing my passion in life, not knowing my gift or my purpose, which I think, that's a big one. It's really important to find that. It's probably closer than you think. Responsibility, money.
E, you have any favorites there?
I have some. Yeah. Fear of failure, my imagination, only the limits in my own mind. That sounds like a privileged position. No. Fear of the poorhouse. Fear of prison and need to make money, which leads to obeying hierarchy. It's interesting how class, race, and everything else are really reflected in these answers. I bet I know every one of you. I know what you did last summer. No.
I will say, did you want to say something, Dan, quickly?
Mike over there.
Get the man the mic.
I want to tell you what fear is. Fear is when I walk out the house, walk down the street, get stopped by a cop, not knowing what's going to happen. What fear is when my son drives away, not knowing what's going to happen if he gets stopped. That's what fear is.
Does that confine you?
Nothing confines me, but that's what fear is for people who can't get past their fear. That's what fear of the unknown is for a black man in New York.
Anyone else want to talk to that?
To piggyback off of that, that's a fear that we all live with, that we constantly have to put away. We have to put that fear away to function every day. As a person that has been arrested multiple times for nothing, harassed for nothing, we have to look at one of the real reasons behind all of this is the economics of this entire system. This system is built on economics. It's built to take advantage of someone. So the person with the least amount of economic resources has the least amount of political influence, and that's the person that's going to get victimized. That's the black, that's the brown people. You look at Ferguson, Missouri, their municipality in Ferguson makes 78% of their money off of petty crimes, death tickets, all given to black people, people of color. So you get that interaction between the police officers because they aggressively have to pursue this economic system. So we put each other in these positions where violence does come about in that. So the penal system, the private penal system that went from 300,000 prisoners to now 2.2 million prisoners, from 6 private prisons to now 120 private prisons holding 78,000 inmates. At that rate, it's not going to change. It's going to only increase because they've found an economic resource in people.
They found that as the economic resource while they're cutting taxes on the people who would otherwise be supporting the budgets of our cities and states around the country. Thank you, Zaire. Zaire is the VJG. I need to close, and I don't almost know how to close this conversation because it could clearly go on and on. But I will ask.
I just wanted to know, do you know that you guys are on the bad side? No, these guys, nothing happens to them at all. When you pull
Just
some of those
random.
red things, it's just like...
I don't know about bad sides and good sides, west sides and east sides, but I'll tell you, I was very moved a couple of weeks ago, I went to the Taconic Correctional Facility in upstate New York. It's the low security or medium security unit across the street from Bedford Hills. And women were performing the vagina monologues inside to people who are currently serving time. And some of the people who were performing were themselves women who had served time. And they had served time across the street at Bedford Hills. And Donna would have been there if she could have been there. Her schedule is so cramped. And women saw women they had left inside. Women saw correctional officers who they hadn't seen since they got out. And one woman pointed out a correctional officer, or rather I could see they greeted each other. You're not allowed to touch in prison, get close, or cozy up, as the guard said. You're not allowed to do any of those things, but I could see they knew each other and there was a warm feeling, and I went and I asked, well, what's the story with that correctional officer? And Sharon said, well, she was one of the good ones. And I said, well, what does that mean to be one of the good ones as a correctional officer? And she said, she spoke life into us. And what she meant was, I said, what do you mean? She said, she told me every day this wasn't my life. This wasn't all my life was going to be, that I had a life outside, that there was going to be more to my life than this. I almost feel like we need to think about that as a society. There is more to our life than this. We can figure out how to get out of this if we take the risk of releasing our confinements of thinking. But on a practical level, you write, Piper, about what difference it made to receive letters and visits. You've talked about the same, Donna. I would like to know, what can we do to shut that distance, to in fact cozy up, to get close to people who are kept away from us, who are kept silenced, whom we're afraid of for really bad reasons. The people we should be afraid of are the people that are right now trying to get our property, our community out from underneath us, who are trying to put us at each other's throats, who are trying to tell us that Zaire is the person that should be locked up. When the person that should be locked up is the person controlling, if you don't mind me saying so, usually the media organization in question. What can we do to breathe life into one another in this struggle as we try to unravel the system that is killing all of us differently?
Well, I'm going to just say that I think that Catherine Gunn said that optimism is a form of social justice, and that, you know, I naively really believe that if the arts were more integrated into the general public's capacity to intersect with these, when it's great, when it's metaphoric, when it changes the hearts, when it changes the chemistry, and yet that's as segregated as all these other issues in this country are, especially in the United States. So I just have to put in a plug for art as absolutely useless as it may currently exist. Doesn't feed people, doesn't build houses, doesn't change attitudes, but it could if we could figure out a distribution system that was equitable.
Specific to prisons, I would simply build on that and say that everything about incarceration and the experience of incarceration encourages you to shut down. To shut down emotionally, to shut down intellectually. And so one of the things that I see that is incredibly important within, if we're going to have these places, if we're going to have prisons and jails, when arts programs, whether it's theater programs, whether it's writing, whether it's music, do get into prisons, it is this incredible access point for people to have agency when, when prisoners are not sitting and passively taking in, but are actively participating in some kind of an arts program. And so I've seen that again and again and again with poetry, with music, with theater, with all of the performing arts particularly. When I say again and again, these programs are so few and far between that I see them because I've been attracted or invited, or I'm so fortunate to get to see them. But the people who go in and help foster those programs are transformed themselves in incredibly profound ways. And the closer we get towards transparency of those walls, so that people can get in and volunteer and bring things into prisons that allow prisoners to regain their sense of agency, the more profound those transformations on both sides will be.
You left out dance.
Damn. I did just recently actually see an astonishing modern dance performance choreographed by a prisoner and performed with him and 3 other prisoners. It was phenomenal.
Footnote.
I want to take it to a different, say something different. You said something about what can we, so it's you and everyone else, do to maybe bring awareness and to humanize and to, help spread the voices of the voiceless, right? So one thing that was missing for a very long time in my life, and in a lot of the women's lives inside, and I'm sure a lot of the men, that people don't try to find them, that people don't look for them, that people don't want to reach out to them. And so for me, and for those of us like me, because I still take them with me, get involved, go inside. You meet me today and you know that my other name is inmate 86G0206. Take a chance and go meet inmate 83G328. Inmate 08G1184. Take a chance and go see them, go talk to them. You will be surprised at how human they really are, how so like you they really are. And I think that will create something in you, because like Piper said, when people come in, because like when Eve came in and others came in, they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave us. At first I thought it was pity. I never wanted anyone to pity me. But the more she stayed, she became steadfast. She just continued and she just stayed on it. The more we grew, we created a relationship that grows to today. And it solidified her place in my life, mine and hers, and it just made her see, and others like her see that, wow, they're just like me. They're just like me. Take the risk. Go see someone inside. Not an inmate, not a convict, not a prisoner. Go see a human being. Because the bottom line is we are one race. One race. Human. And we should never, ever, ever lose sight of that.
I want to take a moment to thank Matt McAdam everyone for the actions. If there are any strings you haven't pulled yet, pull them. To thank Penn World Voices Festival for co-sponsoring tonight, for everything that has been done by the incredible staff and crew of both the Grit TV organization, the Laura Flanders Show, and Streb Slam right here. Thank you all, every single one of you, for the work that you did. Let me remind you that Elizabeth's film, the film about her, Born to Fly, will be on PBS Channel 13 in New York, 10 o'clock on Monday. And I don't know about this whole word humanize. You know, who's sending who to jail for 25 years? Who needs to be humanized? And who needs to take a risk? I thank you for taking the risk to come out to us tonight, and I hope that we see you again.